Every time oil prices drop, people celebrate cheaper energy. Farmers don't. Because the fuel that runs their tractors, powers their irrigation pumps, and keeps refrigerated trucks cold on a 3-day haul, that fuel keeps getting more expensive. Crude oil and agricultural fuel costs have been moving in opposite directions, and the reason is something most economists and most news anchors completely miss. It has nothing to do with greed or speculation, and everything to do with what happens inside a petroleum refinery, a process almost nobody outside the energy industry understands. Here's the part most people get wrong, and it changes how you see every food price on every shelf. Crude oil is not one thing. It spans a wide chemical spectrum defined by two properties: a pi gravity, which measures density, and sulfur content, which measures impurity. A barrel of light sweet crude pulled from the Permian Basin and a barrel of heavy sour crude shipped from the Persian Gulf carry vastly different molecular profiles, need completely different refining infrastructure, and yield entirely different volumes of the one fuel agriculture depends on to survive: diesel. And this is where it gets worse. Conventional thinking treats crude supply as though barrels translate linearly into usable fuel. They do not. The real bottleneck sits inside the specialized secondary processing units of a modern refinery: fluid catalytic crackers, hydrocrackers, and delayed cokers that forcibly rearrange heavy residual oils into lighter transportation and agricultural fuels. Simpler hydro-skimming refineries cannot do this, stuck producing whatever raw distillation gives them, and what it gives them is rarely enough diesel. Numbers strip away any ambiguity. Brent crude, a light sweet benchmark at around 38 degrees API with sulfur below 0.5%, processed through a basic hydro-skimming unit, produces roughly 4% LPG, 32% gasoline, 35% middle distillates, and 29% heavy fuel oil. Switch to Arab Light, a medium sour grade at 33.9 degrees API and 1.8% sulfur. Run through a moderate cracking configuration, and the output shifts to 6% LPG, 35% gasoline, 38% middle distillates, and 21% residual. Now take American shale tight oil, above 42 degrees API, with sulfur below 0.2%. Push it through a high-complexity coking refinery, and the middle distillate yield drops to just 28%. Gasoline and naphtha flood the system instead. More crude flowing into the ground does not mean more diesel flowing into a tractor. Measuring this requires the Nelson Complexity Index, which scores secondary conversion capacity against atmospheric distillation by weighting each unit's capital cost. Vacuum distillation carries a factor of 2, catalytic reforming 5, fluid catalytic cracking 6, and alkylation 10. American refineries average 9.5, converting heavy Mexican and Canadian crudes profitably. European configurations historically averaged just 6.5, far more exposed to light sweet crude supply swings. What this means in practice is brutal. Flooding the market with raw crude during a crisis offers nothing more than a fleeting illusion, because refineries cannot snap their yield slates overnight. Agricultural fuels detach entirely from the headline price of oil, and that gap is where food inflation lives. History has demonstrated this pattern over and over again. Early in the 2000s, European environmental regulations drove a massive consumer shift toward diesel vehicles. But the continent's refineries, many built in the post-war era, were designed to maximize gasoline. By 2006, the United Kingdom and much of continental Europe had become chronic net importers of diesel, dependent on Russia and the Middle East for supply. And that structural deficit fed directly into the 2008 oil price spike. What nobody expected was the shale revolution creating the opposite imbalance. In the late 1990s, Gulf Coast refiners poured billions into delayed cokers and desulfurization units built for heavy sour crude from Venezuela and Mexico. Fracking flipped everything, flooding the market with ultralight tight oil those heavy configured refineries could not efficiently process. Between 2014 and 2016, crude collapsed over 70%, yet diesel refused to follow, exhibiting stubborn downward stickiness that exposed the refining mismatch. 2020 brought a double hit. IMO regulations forced marine bunker sulfur down from 3.5% to 0.5% overnight, which threw the shipping industry into direct competition with agriculture for the same limited pool of middle distillates. COVID then shuttered marginal refineries permanently across the Atlantic basin, and when demand snapped back through 2021 and 2022, the processing capacity to meet it simply no longer existed. Russia's invasion of Ukraine severed Europe's primary diesel pipeline, and the 3 to 2 to 1 crack spread blew past $55 per barrel. Refineries pushed into maximum distillate mode, but the chemical limits of swing cuts and catalytic cracker boundaries blocked them from fully covering the deficit, which meant agricultural consumers absorbed the full weight of those extraordinary costs. And that's when 2026 arrived. Military conflict in the Persian Gulf sealed the Strait of Hormuz, a choke point handling approximately 1/5 of all seaborne crude. 400 million barrels of strategic reserves were released in a coordinated IEA intervention, the largest in history. Here's what the headlines missed. The Middle East had spent the previous decade building enormous, export-oriented mega-refineries, and the blockade trapped approximately 3.3 million barrels per day of finished products, along with 1.5 million barrels per day of LPG. Raw crude prices stabilized under the intervention, but physical diesel and LPG availability collapsed almost overnight. 7 days was all it took for wholesale diesel to surge 53%, the largest 2-week percentage jump on record. WTI crude climbed toward $89.70, while Brent approached $99.79. Both below their 2008 and 2022 peaks. Yet diesel accelerated at a completely disproportionate rate. Ultra-low sulfur diesel reached $4 per gallon at wholesale, which implied a refined product value near $174 per barrel. $64 per barrel, that was the crack spread, the widest the market had ever priced. Agriculture felt the damage immediately, because diesel powers field operations, irrigation, rail freight, maritime shipping, and last-mile distribution. And unlike gasoline, where consumers can simply reduce discretionary trips, diesel demand is inherently rigid. Planting cycles do not wait. Freight contracts do not pause. Biological timelines do not negotiate with energy markets. Sustained U.S. diesel above $4.75 per gallon triggers measurable GDP drag, and crossing $5.25 has historically pushed recession probability above 40%. Ships rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope absorbed over $1 million in extra fuel costs per voyage, while adding more than 10 days to each average transit. When BNSF Railway auctioned its 2026 to 2027 crop year shuttle contracts, winning bids averaged roughly $1.4 million per shuttle, an exceptional premium of approximately $424 per car per trip. Static freight contracts became financially untenable almost immediately after diesel's 53% surge. Logistics providers across North America, Australia, and New Zealand abandoned fixed pricing entirely, pivoting to rolling fuel surcharge models pegged to real-time benchmarks. Every 10% rise in diesel pushes global freight rates up 2 to 4%. In Indonesia, a 30% diesel spike drove base freight costs 10.5 to 12% higher, given that fuel absorbs up to 40% of total trucking expenditure across the archipelago. Margin compression cascaded through the value chain. 81%. That is how far ADM's crush margins fell, leaving the company with its lowest fourth-quarter adjusted profit in 6 years, and triggering a restructuring that slashed up to 700 jobs to chase $500 million to $750 million in savings. Bunge Global's core agribusiness earnings dropped from $639 million to $364 million, a 43% decline, with 2026 guidance of $7.50 to $8 per share landing well below Wall Street's $8.71 consensus. For emerging markets, the damage crossed from financial into existential. Indonesian smallholder rice millers found themselves trapped between a government-mandated farm gate purchase price of 6,500 rupiah per kilogram and a legally enforced retail ceiling of 13,500 rupiah. Rising diesel costs for transportation, drying, and milling destroyed the margin between those two numbers. And numerous millers simply stopped operating, which paradoxically drove localized food inflation higher despite the government's price controls. High diesel prices also opened an arbitrage window that pulled biofuel producers into aggressive competition for the same agricultural feedstocks the food system needed. Chicago soybean oil futures rallied from 66.2 cents to 67.3 cents per pound. Indonesia pushed to increase its mandatory biodiesel blend to B40 and even B50, projecting savings exceeding $10.84 billion in foreign exchange, but forcing up to 50% of the nation's palm oil into fuel tanks inherently tightened the global food supply and wired commodity prices directly to energy mandates. Bangladesh offers the clearest window into what happens next, because the country runs 1.6 million irrigation pumps, nearly 80% of them powered entirely by diesel, and diesel accounts for 73% of total national fuel consumption. Widening crack spreads translate directly into reduced irrigation hours for smallholders on razor-thin margins. Suppressed yields lead to higher food imports, and the inflation cycle deepens with each rotation. Australia's National Farmers Federation warned that prolonged diesel shortages could push retail food prices up by 50%. Cold chain logistics magnified the perishable losses, according to the Arrhenius equation, where even minor temperature excursions from 2 to 5 Celsius drastically cut shelf life. Without active cooling, thermal inertia in a standard reefer gives out within hours, and extending a 3-day strawberry transit to 7 days guarantees catastrophic spoilage. 5 policy interventions scored across deployment speed, cost efficiency, legal feasibility, and historical effectiveness. Temporary standards flexibility like EPA fuel waivers, deployable within 24 to 48 hours, scored highest at 18 out of 20, costing virtually nothing while expanding the fuel pool fast. Refinery run optimization scored 16, legally clean but physically slow, needing days to weeks for thermodynamic transitions. Emergency product swaps scored 15, effective locally but useless against systemic mismatches. Strategic product reserves landed at 11.5, useful in acute crises but prohibitively expensive at $5 to $10 per barrel in capital premium and $7 to $8.60 per barrel annually in maintenance. Demand management and rationing scored lowest at 10.5, devastating in deadweight loss, yet the only mechanism ensuring farms physically receive fuel when everything else fails. Longer-term structural reform demands a different scale of investment. Indonesia's Balikpapan refinery upgrade, a $7.4 billion project expanding capacity from 260,000 to 360,000 barrels per day, combined with a nationwide B50 biodiesel rollout, is projected to eliminate diesel import dependency entirely. Mixed integer linear programming applied to regional agro-hubs can cut transport carbon footprints by over 90%. Transitioning from imported LPG to electric induction cooking alone could save 12 trillion rupiah annually, permanently severing the link between domestic food preparation and global refinery yields. 26 years of evidence from 2000 to 2026 dismantles the belief that securing crude reserves means securing food system energy. Refining rigidity, bound by distillation thermodynamics, hydrocracking hydrogen constraints, and catalytic cracking carbon rejection limits, acts as a severe bottleneck that upstream abundance cannot solve. U.S. farm sector working capital was projected to contract from $154.9 billion in 2025 to $140.6 billion in 2026, a $14 billion erosion in a single year. The Purdue Ag Economy Barometer's Financial Stress Index climbed to 6.5, its highest reading in 7 years, up from just 1.1 in 2023. 21% of respondents expected to need larger operating loans, and of that group, 31% pointed to unpaid operating debt from prior years as the primary cause. That is the self-reinforcing loop at the center of the potato paradox. Crude oil can be artificially cheap. Strategic reserves can flood the market with raw barrels. But if the molecular yield of middle distillates drops because the wrong crude enters the wrong refinery, the specific fuels agriculture depends on detach entirely from the headline price of oil. Crack spreads widen, diesel costs surge, freight rates compound geometrically along the supply chain. Food inflation becomes entrenched. The true bottleneck has migrated from the upstream wellhead to the downstream hydrocracker. And until that reality is confronted with structural reform, capacity investment, and genuine supply chain decoupling, the potato paradox will keep threatening the stability of the global food system, not from a lack of oil in the ground, but from a lack of the right fuel coming out the other end.